What is up, everyone? 30 years of Scream. 30 years ago, the first Scream film came out. We are on the week that the seventh film comes out. Sidney Prescott, the character, Nev Campbell, is returning. Kevin Williamson, the original screenwriter, is back. He's not only writing, he didn't only write the script, he's directing it. We have a lot to talk about this entire week leading up to the seventh Scream. But it's going to be mountains and molehills. It's going to be peaks and valleys throughout this series. But this week, we're talking about the entire franchise. We're diving in, though. We're going to celebrate 30 years of the original Scream. 2026 marks the 30th anniversary of Scream. When Scream came out, it revolutionized how we saw horror. And I'm not being hyperbolic when I say it changed the trajectory of what horror would become. Up until that point, Wes Craven had already established himself as one of the godfathers of American horror. You talk about the 70s, where he came out swinging and had an exploitation film in Last House on the Left. That changed. I feel like every of the big directors we talk, Wes Craven, George Romero, Tobe Hooper, and John Carpenter, I feel like they had every decade they did something new, or at least for the most part throughout the 70s and 80s, definitely in the 90s too. We can talk about that. Wes, I think, is the only one who really had a film in the 70s, a film in the 80s, and a film in the 90s that was truly landmark and changed everything. That's not discrediting George. George did that in the 60s, the 70s, and you could even say the 80s. If you want to consider Day of the Dead that, I think that's a conversation to be had. We've talked about it many times. If you've listened to the audio version of the podcast, the Sight and Sound podcast. But there is no disputing that Wes Craven came out in the 70s, does Last House on the Left, does Hills Have Eyes, is kind of known as really like a screw loose director who makes these really effed up horror movies that have a lot of crazy visual and crazy visuals and acts of unspeakable violence that happen against these victims in films. And then in the 80s, he comes out with A Nightmare on Elm Street, and it literally built an entire film. Something that started New Line Cinema was a distribution company. Bob Shea, who started New Line Cinema, was screening Pink Flamingos out of the back of his car. That changed literally into a legitimate studio with New Line Cinema, and they call New Line Cinema the house that Freddie built before Bob Shea left. And, it was the house that Freddie built. They might not consider themselves that now and think they've grown past it, and they've had crazy hits from the 90s on. They did the Ninja Turtles movie in 1990. They did Dumb and Dumber, which was a smash hit. They've gotten Lord of the Rings, but all that harkens back to Nightmare on Elm Street and what Freddy Krueger did for them, what Wes Craven did for them when Wes and Bob Shea met up and the franchise took off. And Wes was no longer a part of it. He wrote scripts and versions for Dream Warriors Part 3, did not come back and reconcile with some financial falling outs with Bob Shea until New Nightmare in 1994. And we could talk about New Nightmare being a meta predator for Wes to really dive into what he did with Scream just 2 years later. There's a time and a place. We've talked about it a lot. Like I said, in the audio version of what, I'm bringing to you now on this YouTube channel. But Wes obviously revolutionizes monster movies and 80s horror. Freddy is 80s horror. Freddy and Jason are everything about 80s horror. They are the two marquee gold standards in horror. And then everything else kind of colors in the great decade of the 80s horror with Fright Night and House and all these great films that we got. But those were the two juggernauts that held it down in box office and everything else. But in 1996, Wes comes out and he brings the slasher back in full force with directing Scream. That's not to say Kevin Williamson was behind the script. He wrote everything. Williamson deserves so much credit for anybody who grew up through the 90s, myself, many viewers, I'm sure. It gave a real, for the first time, like kids, like, and I was not a teenager in the 90s, not until the early 2000s, but I was seeing people that I immediately related to on some kind of odd secular level, I think. But the thing with Scream is it gave realism to these kids that were aware of how horror movies are, and they were seeing their lives play out through an actual horror movie. Scream comes out in the end of December, I think a couple days before Christmas, and it does okay. Word of mouth blows up, ends up earning over $100 million in theater. And it spawns Scream 2 the following year, Scream 3 3 years later, Scream 4, what was that, 11 years later. And then Wes passes away in 2015, unfortunately, to brain cancer. And then we end up getting 5 and 6 in 2022 and 2024. And now here we are we are 30 years past the original one, and this iconic franchise is still trucking along. We can say what we want about how it is. These last two films have been, they've left a lot on the table, I think, and a lot of meat on the bone, unfortunately. But I do think with Sidney Prescott, the character, Neve Campbell coming back to portray that character, without Sidney Prescott, there is no Scream franchise. She is everything. To a lot of people, and myself included, I think she is as vital to Scream as Ghostface is. I think without Ghostface, obviously the franchise doesn't work. Without Sidney Prescott, Neve Campbell playing Sidney Prescott, I don't think a Scream film works. And honestly, I think maybe people felt that way in the 80s when Heather Langenkamp only came back for the third one and not again until New Nightmare. I think people maybe felt that way as well. Those films were successful without her, but it doesn't make them all amazing. They all are enjoyable, I will say that. But anyway, this isn't about Nightmare on Elm Street. This is about Scream. And it's so funny to hear, and if you've watched any of the special features on any of the releases over the last 30 some odd year, almost 30 years, I love that, unfortunately, Jamie Kennedy made a comment where he called the Weinsteins, as bad as especially Harvey Weinstein was. He talked about how they were tastemakers and there was no denying their talent for finding taste. I argue that for multiple reasons, and I'll go direct to Bob Weinstein. Bob Weinstein saw the dailies for Scream, told Wes they were terrible, refused to accept what they were going to put out, made them, Wes and the production, try out 7 different masks, didn't think the mask was scary, didn't know what the hell the dailies were, wasn't getting it, and he said, wait, I'll send you the first scene with Drew, and, you'll get it. Notably did this, Rob Zombie has told stories about the Weinsteins, Bob as well, about how it was just a nightmare to work with them. They're two guys that I think, it's easy to attack Harvey Weinstein because he's obviously a POS, but Bob Weinstein too, thinking he knew more than he did. These guys were money boys. They were nothing more than money boys. I don't think the Weinsteins were tastemakers. I think they just got things dropped in their lap and they lucked out. But I will say this. They ended up sending Bob Weinstein the first scene with Drew, the opening scene of Scream, and then he calls Wes back and says, what do I know about dailies? You're making the movie. It looks great. Keep doing what you're doing. Of course, because then it was probably undeniable after seeing that scene. But unfortunately for Jamie to say that they were tastemakers, and I don't think he was trying to say anything controversial. They obviously had a tremendous success with Miramax and Dimension, Crying Game, and From Dusk Till Dawn. I know Robert Rodriguez worked with them a bunch on his earlier films, but to give them credit is, yes, allowing the productions and getting them underway, sure. To say that they were tastemakers, to say there wouldn't be a Dusk from Dusk Till Dawn because of their taste, I don't buy that. And I don't buy that with Scream either. Kevin Williamson wrote it. That's the art. Wes Craven directed it. That's the art. The actors that made this film so memorable, the people that love Matthew Lillard, love Skeet Ulrich, love Nev Campbell, love Rose McGowan, love David Arquette, love Courtney Cox. Those characters and those stars signed Scream stuff today because of their portrayal and because of Wes's direction and because of Kevin Williamson's writing. Has nothing to do with the Weinsteins. The Weinsteins don't deserve that credit. They were money boys. That's what most studio heads are. And yes, are there studio heads that are tastemakers and that do have their finger on the pulse? Absolutely. I do think because they're in charge of the money and they're in charge of the decisions, they often get hurled with more, and because they make the decisions, you have to kind of bend the knee to them in Hollywood. And that's probably part of the problem that why Harvey Weinstein did the atrocious things that he did. Regardless, yeah, they get overcredited. If I hear them get credited, yeah, I don't know. I think they're overcredited and they're not credited a lot, but any credit that they get, hearing, unfortunately, Jamie Kennedy say that, and nothing against him. I've met Jamie Kennedy at a con. He's very nice, super personable, respects and loves what Wes Craven, gave to him and allowing him the opportunity to portray the role of Randy Meeks and everything. But I do think calling them tastemakers is, even though it's not intended, and it's not intended to take anything away from Wes or Kevin or the rest of the cast, to call them tastemakers is a joke because Bob Weinstein literally was on the brink of firing Wes because he didn't. I don't get what the dailies are. You don't get anything, dude. You're a money boy. Be quiet. Anyway, yeah. So 30 years ago, this film comes out in December of 1996. And when it came, I didn't see it until I think spring of 97, whenever it came out on VHS in 1997. I want to say it was early 97, I think, or mid 97. It might be a mid 97. Whenever it came out, I remember when it came out, and I remember my parents buying Scream at, I think it was still Phase. It may have changed to Eckerd's. Not sure. They bought the VHS, and it was the one with, they had several different VHS covers. They had like Courtney Cox on a cover, Drew on a cover, Nev on a cover. They bought the Nev one. And I had that VHS for years. Unfortunately, I don't anymore. And I know it's on, you can get them all on eBay now. Obviously, everyone's selling everything, and especially VHSs. There's a litany of people that have collections. But yeah, they're, great marketing for it. I loved all the VHS covers. There was actually, I remember going to the store a couple weeks later, seeing multiple VHS covers for it and thinking like, oh, geez, it's stupid to buy the same movie over again just because I want all the different covers. But I remember putting that in on like an afternoon, maybe a Saturday or Sunday afternoon, and watching Scream for the first time and being enamored with it. Immediately going to Phase or Eckerd's. I think it was still Phase. I'm not sure. I think it was. I could be wrong. No, it was definitely still Phase, I think. And getting the Ghostface mask. I have it here. This is right here. Bam. This is an original Ghostface mask, not by Fun World, or by Fun World technically, but this is one of the original ones, and it was getting put out under Easter. I don't know if you can see if we can get that focused, but it's called Easter Unlimited Incorporated, and it says made in China. But yeah, this is an original drugstore version of the Ghostface mask. It was put out by Fun World. It was distributed through, I think, distributed by Fun World, but I think Easter Unlimited was the Chinese manufacturer, I think, that was making these. And if it's not, I'll pull that information up and you'll see it right here. But yes, this was bought in 1997. I think around Halloween time of 1997, and I've had it since. It got out of my grasp for a few years, but then I discovered it in a tote of Halloween stuff at my parents' house, and I made sure I grabbed it, and I now hold on to this because this is something I bought when I was 9 years old, or was bought for me when I was 9 years old, and I still have it. So, and it's right here, right in the drawer. But yeah, it's and the craze of everything with Ghostface and Scream, the craze of everyone was Ghostface after that for like 3 years. And people still, you still see people that are in Ghost. Even the lull years between like 2000 and 2011, they were putting out different variations of Ghost Mask. They were putting out green ones. They were putting out blood-soaked ones. They were putting out scarecrow ones. They were putting out demon ones. They were putting out pumpkin ones. Everyone was Ghostface, it felt like, for years after that. And it's still a very popular costume to buy. It's every year there's a new variation, and there's the classic always at Spirit Halloween or any Halloween store, Walmart, wherever you go to get your Halloween stuff. It's always there, and I feel like it will always be there, just like the generic hockey mask that we see at every store always. And that speaks to the legacy of just that. But seeing this young cast, Matthew Lillard, Skeet Ulrich, Nev, Jamie Kennedy, this entire cast just live on through conventions and everything is so fun, because they still have so much fun talking about it. And I love the reverence for Wes. Every single one of them has a deep reverence for Wes, and they're super appreciative and super grateful. And I think that's sometimes lost on some actors, and nothing against Johnny Depp, but Johnny Depp, I think, he's like, oh, yeah, got my first start at a horror film. Not a bad gig. And kind of doesn't really take his moment to really, truly give Wes his flowers, because I think that ended up getting him, like, Platoon. You have to think, right, that it got him Platoon, because Platoon filmed throughout 85 and wasn't released till 86, and he was in Nightmare on Elm Street in 84. You have to think that played into it, but regardless, it's very sad that some people don't do that, but I love that this cast, whenever they can talk about West, I love that this cast, whenever they talk about Wes, they speak with reverence and kindness, and they revere him, because Wes wasn't like tattooed and pierced up and looked like he's, like maybe a typical, and I have tattoos, like, whatever. But if they're covered, I think I look like a normal guy. I'm not wearing anything like crazy outlandish or anything, but, everyone thinks that, I think there's a portion of the population that thinks everyone looks like Dee Snider in Strangeland if you're a horror fan. There are definitely some sects of the universe that think like that. And Wes was very, and I think Robert Englund has said this multiple times, Wes was very erudite. He was very professor. He was a professor at Clarkson. It was on Elm Street. That's where the name came from. He looked like just a normal guy. Who would think that this guy had twisted thoughts in his head? I believe Nev Campbell has made that comment as well. A guy that wrote that did a movie called Last House on the Left, and did The Hills Have Eyes, and to think that he was behind it. Some of the darkest horror movies of our time were done by this dude that looked like he was just, sipping a coffee, grading papers, and just being the most normal guy next door ever. Wes is just, he's someone I think doesn't get credit that's due sometimes. I think people forget that he put out two landmark exploitation films in The Hills Have Eyes and Last House throughout the 70s, and then in the 80s doing Nightmare on Elm Street, and all the other films that don't get credit when you talk about Serpent and the Rainbow and Deadly Friend, Deadly Blessing, the People Under the Stairs. We've done episodes on it on the podcast, and The People Under the Stairs, I think, is one of the most criminally underrated films in all of horror. If you haven't seen it, please go see it. And if you've seen it, you know what I'm talking about. You know how great that film is. And in 94, like the whole meta thing with New Nightmare and Nightmare on Elm Street, and people portraying, themselves, and it's just the world separate, but not that whole thing. The Scream very meta. They're very aware that this is like a horror movie. It's very ahead of its time. And I think people have jacked the Scream people have taken so much from the ideas of Kevin Williamson and the creativity of Wes, and they haven't. I don't know if they've given it back by saying like, "Hey, I was influenced by this. Hey, I stole this from you." But 30 years, Scream is still running strong, and I don't know if anybody says that the first film isn't the best. The first film is definitely the best by a mile. Scream 2 is great, and we're talking about that one tomorrow. So if you're watching this today, Monday, tomorrow the video's coming out for Scream 2. And we're going to talk about that and what we think about that as a sequel and the kind of the history behind that. There is, if you own the Blu-ray set of this, and I think the 4Ks have the ported over special features from it, there's the Still Screaming doc that I think either A&E did, or I can't remember who did it initially. I think it was E Tonight maybe did that, but they go into the whole thing about how they did the thing at the Santa Rosa high school, and the high school pulled out because they said it was too violent. And it's funny, Wes puts at the end of the film, no thanks to Santa Rosa High School and the Board of Education or whatever. They ended up filming in another high school. There's so much cool lore to this film, and a lot of people came and their careers launched from it. I mean, Nev and Skeet were in The Craft the same year. I think The Craft came out, I think in April or May, I think, of '96, and we get them both as the two, more or less leads in Scream, and their careers launch. And when people say Nev Campbell, Skeet Ulrich, this is the first film they still think about. A lot of people that maybe aren't super well versed in Matthew Lillard's catalog, besides maybe Shaggy, they think of this first. I mean, we did a video on Lillard a few videos back. His brilliance in the '90s and everything that he's done. He should be known for everything he does because the guy's amazing. But yeah, so 30 years of Scream. It's a landmark film that's just, it changed the way it brought slashers back. The early '90s, I think, were a fun time. There was a lot of great horror films from like '90 to like '95. There are a ton in there. They weren't big mainstream successes the way Scream became, but there was a lot of great horror in the early '90s. We did a video on the best, 3 underrated horror films from 1990. Every year there was great horror films in the '90s. I think they get overlooked because the '80s were so powerful and so revered for slashers and horror in general. And then Scream came, so like that brink of entering the '90s until Scream, a lot of those horror movies get forgotten. We'll be talking about them on the channel. Don't worry. But I will say this. Scream changed the trajectory of what slashers and horror would become. It changed course. It made slashers viable again. We had a myriad of copycat films after that, sequels, everything. And the marketing in horror is what really kind of makes it fun. Like the masks, the Ghostface mask. Obviously, there's the big controversy with Fun World and another guy that says that he created it and they didn't license it from them legally or whatever. But the marketing for the films, the Jason mask, the Freddy glove, the Ghostface mask, like that's all. They're all in the same thing now. And we saw, like, was able to grow up being part of the crowd that first saw the Ghostface mask, and watch it grow 25. 30 years later, like I'm talking about Scream 7. It's crazy. But yeah, we're gonna be talking about Scream 2 tomorrow. If you like Wes Craven, I have stickers. I made these stickers maybe a couple of years ago. I still have a bunch, so if you want them, hit me up and I'll send you one of the podcast stickers as well as a Wes Craven sticker. Merch will be coming soon. We will have more stickers and t-shirts, not Love Burger ones, but they will be Heart Guide Media shirts, printed on something nice too. We won't skimp, no Gildan, but Gildan owns Comfort Colors now, so I guess I shouldn't say that. Scream 2 tomorrow, and welcome to Scream Week, baby. All leading up to Scream 7. We're here all week.